So who exactly are the mysterious Squad Zero? While these characters may have just made their first appearance in the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime, the truth is that for the longest time these guys were total unknowns to us fans. Yes, we knew they existed. In fact, we've known they existed for a very long time before they actually made their first official appearance in the story. But their role as an elite and secretive division of the Soul Society dedicated entirely to defending the Soul King, who himself was also an incredibly unknown variable, and the Royal Palace, made sure that we were desperate to see and learn more about them. And so while anime-only viewers have just been given their first glimpse of the Zero Division, this mythical division that isn't technically affiliated with the Gotei 13 itself, we do know a decent bit more about them, although much about the Zero Division still remains shrouded in mystery. And so I wanted to create this video to be something of an overview of everything that we do know about the legendary and elusive Zero Division so far, as well as the Royal Palace. So of course, with that in mind, there will be full spoilers for the entire Thousand Year Blood War arc, and even some of the supplementary material like Can't Fear Your Own World. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do have a Patreon as well. And as always, I just want to say a massive shout out and thank you to everyone who is supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. So before we actually reach the Thousand Year Blood War arc itself, before we actually get to see the Zero Division in all their glory, what did we know about them prior to this? Were they ever mentioned in the story beforehand? Well, despite the utmost secrecy surrounding their existence, yes, there were a few, and when I say few, I really do mean it. Throughout the course of about 450 chapters, these guys were maybe only mentioned 3 times total. So there were a few tiny snippets of information that were dropped like breadcrumbs to us readers, which only meant that we were speculating more and more about these characters as time went on, and we were more excited to actually see them when they would eventually arrive. The earliest possible mention of the Royal Guard is actually all the way back in chapter 48. When Rukia witnesses a Menos Grande emerging from the sky, she claims it's the first time she's ever seen one outside of illustrations, and that normally, dealing with a Menos Grande is left up to the Royal Special Task Force. Rukia claims that dealing with a Menos Grande is way beyond the skills and abilities of a single Shinigami. Now, of course, the legitimacy of this being an actual mention of the Zero Division can be kind of called into question, as Kubo would change the overall threat level of the Menos Grande as the story went on, eventually sort of turning them into foot soldiers or grunts of the overall Arrancar army, to the point where individual Vizards were capable of easily swatting away 2, 3, 4 of these guys at a time. According to Can't Fear Your Own World, the task of dealing with Menos Grande is in order to ensure that the balance of the universe remains intact. And so if it is true that one of the tasks of the Royal Guard is to take care of the Menos Grande, but they don't currently seem to, it seems as though that would be a holdover from the most ancient of days, the primordial world where the Soul King himself annihilated hollow after hollow in order to defend the inhabitants of that universe. But of course, some of that is speculation on my part. We have no idea if Kubo really does still consider it the job of the Zero Division to take on Menos Grande, considering they never seem to, but we can supplement this with information gleaned from the light novel. Perhaps a more up-to-date mention of the Zero Division is given to us in chapter 223. Here, upon detailing what appears to be Aizen's true motive, Yamamoto details the existence of the Oken, known as the Royal Key, that gains you access to the Royal Palace. And here, of course, he also talks about the king and even a royal family, which also didn't seem to ever actually come to pass. But at the same time, Yamamoto mentions that the king, the palace and the special dimension that all of this can be found in is defended by a royal security corps. While it seems like Kubo would still continue to tweak what would eventually become the actual ecosystem of the royal palace in the future, this absolutely would go on to serve as the basis, as the foundation for what we knew to be the Zero Division moving forwards. However, the mention of the Royal Guard that would really get fans excited and really set people into speculation mode can be found in the very first chapter of the mini flashback arc Turn Back the Pendulum. 110 years before the main story, it's revealed that the then current captain of the 12th Division, Kiryu Hikifune, at this point never seen on screen, was just recently offered a promotion, a mysterious promotion from the place of captain, and accepted it. And this was 7 days prior to this first chapter of Turn Back the Pendulum. According to Kyoraku, Hikifune has actually already gone and met up with her new colleagues, which is why we don't see her in this flashback arc. Interestingly, once Kyoraku reveals this tidbit of info, Ukitake seems to imply that this process of accepting the promotion and going to meet up with the rest of the Zero Division was something that Hikifune could have taken her time with and didn't need to rush into, didn't need to accept and move on with immediately, but it was something that she chose to do. A vice captain at the time, Aizen, overhearing this, believed that Hikifune to be promoted from the place of captain meant there was only one place she could go, the Central 46. However, Kyoraku corrects him on this and reveals for the first time properly that Hikifune was promoted to the Royal Guard, or the Zero Division. Presumably, although this is Aizen we're talking about here, but presumably the very notion, the very existence of this special Royal Guard was something that was unknown to probably most of the vice captains at the time. This would be the last time we would ever hear about the Zero Division until the final arc of Bleach, but thanks to this, fans were excited. Firstly, and most importantly, there was now a name that we could actually attribute to these characters, Kiryu Hikifune. Although we never saw her, she would go down in history as being the only member of this mysterious Zero Division that we would know the name of for an extremely long time before the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Just the simple fact of having this name made the Zero Division feel more real, rather than just something like a concept that Kubo was maybe toying with. In fact, they felt so real that many of us expected them to show up during Aizen's assault on Karakura Town right at the very end of the Arrancar arc, but of course, they would not make an appearance. And this was way before we knew anything about their strict rules, anything about the fact that they don't interfere with the Gotei 13 whatsoever. Fast forward to the weeks and months before the 1,000-Year Blood War arc would be released, and Kubo would reveal in an interview that he had decided to allow the Zero Division to appear, and so of course people were extremely excited about that. Because presumably if the Zero Division are going to appear, that means the Royal Palace is going to appear, which means the Soul King would appear. He himself having been tantalizingly teased at the very end of the Arrancar arc. And people speculated all sorts of different things about the Zero Division, I myself thinking they might look more akin to a normal division of the Gotei 13, with seated officers, with foot soldiers, and with maybe more than one captain, but certainly with some people leading the group. However, finally, come the devastating death of Yamamoto and the complete destruction of Soul Society at the end of the first Quincy invasion in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, the Quincy King Yhwach firmly believed that that would be enough to draw out the Zero Division, and he was right. Come chapter 516, helpfully titled The Squad Zero, they finally made their long-awaited appearance. For some of us, this was genuinely about a decade in the making. Interestingly, Squad Zero clearly give some kind of an indicator to those down below that they are about to arrive, but then refuse to elaborate further on the reasoning for their sudden arrival, bearing in mind some of these captains haven't seen these guys for centuries, if not longer, and I would also go so far as to assume that many of the captains in the current lineup of the Gotei 13 probably haven't met any of them at all. So now that we've got the history of these guys out of the way, who's actually in the Zero Division? Well, it's only made up of 5 members, each powerful former captains in their own right. Or at least we think they're former captains. Some of them definitely are, but with others, it's definitely a little bit more dubious. These 5 characters are Ichibei Hyosabe, Oetsu Nimaya, Korinji Tenjiro, Senjumaru Shutara, and, you guessed it, Kiryu Hikifune. We could finally put a face to the name. I explicitly remember after 516 came out and all we were left with was that final double-page spread, people were furiously speculating which of the 2 women was going to be Hikifune. Kyoraku goes as far to say that the combined might of these 5 individual captains is greater than that of the entire Gotei 13. Certainly that is quite the hype statement to make. Despite their alleged immense power, however, that is not the reason these guys were promoted to the Zero Division in the first place, as I think many of us speculated it would be. We kind of assumed that they were all given this role due to being extraordinarily powerful. However, Kubo takes it in a more unique and, in my opinion, interesting route. These guys were all promoted due to making significant historical contributions to the Soul Society. So let's briefly break down each of the 5 members. Firstly, you've got Ichibei, the leader of the Zero Division, and come the Thousand-Year Blood War, the de facto leader of all Shinigami. Ichibei is one of the most ancient beings in the entire story, and still to this day feels like a genuine mystery. Known by his title of the monk who calls the true name, Ichibei's contribution was naming virtually everything in the universe of Bleach. Shikai, Bankai, the Seirei, all of that was named by Ichibei himself. In combat, Ichibei wields a massive calligraphy brush called Ichimonji, which has the power to cut names. Up next is Oetsu Nimaya, the Divine General of the West, also known by his title as God of the Sword. Much like Ichibei before him, Oetsu's origins are hard to pin down, as he is another being who is extraordinarily old. Through the forging of the Asauchi, Oetsu was responsible for creating what would be the modern-day concept of the Zanpakuto, the Asauchi being empty Zanpakuto shells, essentially, with the capacity to become anything. Due to being effectively the god of all Zanpakuto, when it comes to combat, Oetsu has a wide variety of blades that he can choose from. The only one we actively see him use, however, is a blade called Sayafushi, one so impossibly sharp that he himself considers it a failed Zanpakuto, one that is unstable to use, and one that no sheath can contain. Then we have Senjumaru, who out of all the members of the Zero Division has my personal favourite design. She is known as the Divine General of the North, or the Great Weave Guard. Senjumaru is responsible for creating essentially the uniform of the Gotei 13, the famous Shihakusho outfit that we've all come to know so very well. In combat, we see her, albeit very briefly, wielding a large sewing needle as her weapon, and it's heavily implied that much like Hikifune, she was once a part of the 12th Division before her eventual promotion. Speaking of Hikifune, she is also known as the Divine General of the South and the Ruler of Grain. Hikifune's contribution to the history of Soul Society was the creation of the artificial soul and the process of Jikongan and the ingesting of souls. The very idea of Jikongan came from Hikifune's own innate ability to take her Reiatsu and imbue other things with it. Specifically using her impressive culinary skills, Hikifune is able to imbue food with her own Reiatsu, giving it amazing properties. When she does this, however, it expends an awful lot of her Reiatsu, almost all of it in fact, forcing her to have to, shall we say, gain a little bit of weight prior to doing so, meaning that Hikifune has something of a unique design in that she can almost instantaneously swap between an overweight version and a slender version of herself. And in combat, she wields a giant spatula. Finally, we've got Tenjiro, the Divine General of the East, who has the title the Hot Springs Demon. And it was these hot springs that was Tenjiro's contribution to the history of Soul Society. Hot springs so potent with healing ability that he was able to even revive the nearly deceased Byakuya. In my opinion, this is the only contribution out of the 5 of them that feels a little bit flimsy. Like, I'm not entirely sure how this particular contribution, which feels extremely specific, really kind of aided the actual historical growth of Soul Society itself. Unless, of course, Tenjiro, by extension, was also the creator of Kaido, the healing branch of Kido. Now that I could actually understand, and it is mentioned that he was the one who taught Unohana a number of the techniques that she would eventually become revered for. During his time in Soul Society, Tenjiro was so fast and so proficient with Shunpo that he was known as Lightning Fast Tenjiro. And in combat, he wields an ore called Kinpika and seemingly has the ability to freely manipulate water. Okay, so that's who makes up the Zero Division, but what actually are these guys? Well, they have one pretty simple job: defend the royal palace and, by extension, the Soul King at all times. They keep themselves almost entirely separate from the Gotei 13, to the point where they do not interact with them for centuries at a time. Tenjiro even says to Soifon that it's their job as the Gotei 13 to protect the Seirete, while it's the Zero Division's job to protect the king. And as long as both sides do their job well, they should never have to come together. Interestingly though, it does feel like the Zero Division has authority over the Seirete in some respects. When the Seirete does get defeated by the Vandenreich in the first Quincy invasion, the Soul King supposedly sends the Zero Division down to clean up their mess, with Ichibei even saying that they have been sent there by his will to help rebuild the Gotei 13. Like the divisions of the Gotei 13, although not actually affiliated with them, the Zero Division does still wear the same uniform, complete with their own insignia in the form of the flower, the Winter Daphne. Interestingly, Daphnes don't bear petals of their own, instead they grow tougher leaves that look like petals, and while they are renowned for having rich, amazing scents and beautiful appearances, all Daphne flowers are actually poisonous. I find this to be really interesting, and while this is only speculation on my part, I can't help but wonder if this symbolises the fact that the Zero Division are this majestic, revered force who do kind of come down from the heavens with this incredible splendour, but they don't really care about the Gotei 13 outside of maybe on a surface level. They are really only in it for themselves, particularly characters like Ichibei, who is willing to do literally anything to maintain the status quo, even if that means taking Ichigo by force and subjecting him to a horrible future as the Soul King. You get the sense, again, particularly where Ichibei is concerned, that behind his wide, almost bulbous eyes and massive manic, toothy grin, there is a pretty cold and callous individual. Each member of the Zero Division, upon getting that promotion, also has their very bones imbued with the power of the Oken by the Soul King himself. This, of course, gives them access to the Royal Palace. An interesting tidbit surrounding the Oken and the Royal Palace is that thanks to having the very power of the Oken infused with their bodies, the Zero Division are technically immortal as long as the Royal Palace remains standing. If the palace has survived an attack, and at least one member of the Zero Division is around, that member of the Zero Division can then revive the other ones continuously. So even though the Zero Division are killed by the Schutzstaffel, we find out in Can't Fear Your Own World that they are able to be resurrected. Speaking of the Royal Palace, we again were given our first glimpse of it in this week's episode of the anime. But there is also a decent amount to cover here as well. So while earlier on in Bleach it was mentioned that the Royal Palace was in its own separate dimension from the rest of the Soul Society, that doesn't seem to have quite made its way into the final version of this location. However, it is so separate that it may as well be. In fact, the Royal Palace exists quite literally above the Soul Soul Society, but so far out of reach that it takes an exorbitantly long amount of time to get between the two, depending on the mode of transport you use, that is, anyway, and there are numerous different ways to go between the locations. Although the Zero Division might not get out much, when they do deem it necessary to travel, they have several ways of doing so. The first and foremost way of getting down to the Soul Society is to use the Tenchuren, which again we saw in the latest episode of the anime. It's basically a massive divine pillar which blasts them down to the Seirete, and they crash upon the ground below with an incredible force, making quite the entrance. However, whoever created the Tenchuren didn't really think about it the entire way through, as the Tenchuren is revealed to have no means of its own to return to the palace, so instead it needs to be blasted back up there with the Kukaku Flower Crane Cannon. And so of course that begs the question, how close-knit is the Shiba clan to the Zero Division? And it's interesting as well that the Zero Division doesn't seem to care that the Shiba clan has fallen from grace. I'm presuming the politics of the noble houses is something that the Zero Division are way too far above to really care about. And I believe, again, going back to Can't Fear Your Own World, we even see some semblance of this, particularly with Ichibei, who has been through it all, who has seen it all, and has seen most of the events that have transpired from his lofty perch in the royal palace, so the squabbles of the noble houses are not really of any concern to him. We also see Oetsu Nimaya utilize a brand new type of portal called the Chokaimon, which has the ability to send Ichigo right from the royal palace all the way back to the human world. The Chokaimon is interesting, not only in that it's able to cover such a massive distance with such ease, but also the fact that it can have a timer set to it, enabling it to reappear and allow Ichigo back into the royal palace so long as those arrival and departure times are correctly synced up. If Ichigo hadn't learned the truth about his origins in time, presumably the Chokaimon would have opened and then closed again forever without him being there to get inside. And then finally, a massive staircase can be unraveled from the royal palace approach itself, leading all the way back down to the Seirete. This feels like something of a last resort method of transport for the royal guard, because it takes an extremely long time to get there. Depending on how fast you are moving, this staircase will either take as little as half a day if you are absolutely blitzing it from start to finish, or it could take as long as an entire week. Now, there are several defensive mechanisms in place to keep the royal palace safe at all times, one of which we never actually get to see used to defend the royal palace, which is kind of strange, but that is of course the massive Seki wall that comes crashing down around the Seirete as Ichigo and his friends try to invade, all the way back at the start of the Soul Society arc. But Kyoraku himself mentions that these walls are not normally here, they've only remained around the Soul Society due to the rather tumultuous events that have been going on, ranging from Ichigo's invasion to Aizen's betrayal to the war against the Urankar. There's really been no reason to send the walls back up. Although you would assume that if the Shinigami realised that Aizen's motive is to take out the king, those walls would have gone back up. The palace is also further protected by 72 individual barriers between it and the Seirete, which can be forced open either by the Oken or by Oken-imbued clothing, something that Senju is capable of creating. There is a weakness, however. If these particular barriers are opened, they cannot be shut again for almost 2 hours, allowing anyone to travel freely from the Soul Society to the Royal Palace, as we see Yhwach take advantage of. Now, within the Royal Palace itself, we have the general Royal Palace approach, which is where you are supposed to arrive at before eventually carrying on to the rest of your destinations. You have in the centre the Royal Citadel, that massive cocoon-shaped palace where the Soul King himself resides at the very top, and surrounding this palace you have 5 individual floating cities, one to be governed by each member of the Zero Division. I was actually wondering this just earlier, but since Hikifune was only relatively recently promoted, presumably by the power of the Soul King, they just created a brand new city for her the moment she was. Ichibe's city is not explored in particular detail. It's unnamed, and the central building of this city takes the form of a massive dojo that sits atop a mountain, atop a colossal flight of stairs. And what's unique about this area is that the air is constantly thick with an insanely dense reishi, making it nearly impossible to stand on your own 2 feet until you become strong enough to deal with it. Nimaya Oetsu's city, known as Hohoden, is actually shown off quite a bit. At first, he presents visitors with a sham city, a sham fake version of his own central building, which is basically just a flashy party pad filled with entertainment and beautiful women. However, out the back is the true version of Oetsu's central building. The true version of the central point of Oetsu City is in fact a pathetic, downtrodden shack that's situated on an outcrop of land above a massive expanse of water. And deep beneath this building is the forge where Oetsu creates the Asauchi. Senjumaru's palace is also unnamed and is probably the one we see the absolute least of, but we do get to see that it is covered from head to toe in various fabrics, various drapes, all of amazing colours and beauty. It looks fantastic, and every single inch is covered with different fabrics, but that's basically all we get to see of it. Hikifune's palace, called the Gaton Den, is a series of ornate domed buildings designed specifically for cooking and dining. And then finally we have Tenjiro's palace, called Kirin Den, which is basically designed to look like a spa with a massive series of underground springs built into an enormous basin of rock. Much later into the 1000-Year Blood War arc, when we would reach the final third of the story, Yhwach would successfully kill the Soul King and conquer the royal palace and transform it, turning it into the foundation stone, the central point for what he would hope to have become his brand new world. This new Quincy royal palace would now go by the name of Wahrwelt, and all of the 5 cities would of course be covered in the icy Quincy buildings, while the actual central royal citadel would be destroyed entirely and replaced with a massive towering fortress atop which Yhwach's original palace of Silburn would now sit. The 5 individual cities, which of course have now been overthrown, the Zero Division replaced by the Schutzstaffel, would now be connected by massive icy pathways, Quincy buildings littering each one, and the 5 disc-like cities that once made up the royal palace now form a gigantic Quincy cross. And finally, while the Zero Division is only made up of 5 captains and has no foot soldiers of its own, they do have command over an elite squadron of warriors known as the Divine Soldiers. These warriors are really interesting, I think. They wear totally unique uniforms, the likes of which we have never seen before, and they can be commanded to attack enemies as an entire group, of which Senjumaru tentatively calls them the Blade of the Soul King. However, despite their apparent ferocity and the fact that they are charged with defending the royal palace at the command of the Zero Division, Yhwach believes that his simple soldat will be enough to deal with them. Now, there are even stronger variations of these soldiers as well, known as the Divine Soldiers second class or second level, who are essentially massive versions of the Divine Soldiers, now bearing huge shields as well. But that's pretty much everything right now about the Zero Division, the Squad Zero, the Royal Guard, whatever you want to call them, and the Royal Palace that they are charged with defending. I'm hoping that the anime will be able to expand even more on these characters as it moves forward. I'm really looking forward to any potential nuggets of information they decide to give us which we didn't already know, as I still believe today that the Royal Palace, this whole ecosystem featuring the Soul King, is one of the series' greatest mysteries, even with the knowledge that we do have now. But of course, let me know if there was anything I missed about these mysterious characters and the world that they come from, that they operate in, that most of Soul Society, the majority of Shinigami, would never even come to know. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.